es Becka.
Mi nombre es Pablo.
My name's Sam.
Thanks for watching us on DPS TV.
So in ecology, we think about the relationships between different populations of animals and how those animals and plants interact with their environments. I'm sorry, can I start again? So in ecology, we think about the interactions between different organisms living in an environment. And one of the ways that we can think about those interactions is we can think about the way that energy passes through those organisms as they either produce that energy from their environment or consume each other to gain that energy. So if we could jump to my screen here. So to talk about this, we talk about something called trophic levels. So trophic levels are really just sort of like levels on the food chain. If you're at the first trophic level, you're at the bottom of the food chain. And you're actually something called an autotroph, or a producer. So another name for an autotroph is a producer. And just like the name sounds, a producer produces its own food. In autotroph, the section of the word auto refers to self, and troph refers to feeding, so it's a self-feeding organism. And if that sounds a little bit strange to you, it's actually fairly common. All plants are producers or autotrophs. They're able to photosynthesize using energy from the sun to convert carbon dioxide in the air and water that they absorb through their roots into glucose sugar, which they then are able to use for energy and store for energy as well. So plants and certain other types of organisms are producers because they produce their own food, also called autotrophs. Humans and animals writ large are heterotrophs. So heterotrophs are going to need to consume something else. So hetero being a mix or other, and troph again being feeding. Feeding on another. So heterotrophs have to consume some other kind of organism in order to gain their energy. So again, heterotrophs are also known as consumers. So I mentioned earlier that plants are able to obtain their energy by photosynthesizing. So they're really using the energy from the sun to convert molecules in their environment into a molecule, a sugar molecule, which stores that energy and can be used to produce energy for the plant or for organisms that eat it later. So if you think about it, the sun is really the source of all organism energy on the Earth. And I should say there are a couple exceptions to that, which I'll get to right at the end. But generally speaking, it's fair to say that the sun provides all of the energy that organisms get on the Earth. And so we'll sort of walk through how that happens. So if you look at my diagram here, I've got this pyramid which shows producers moving to consumers. And is it sort of a little bit strange maybe because I've got the sun down at the bottom, and I know we're used to thinking of the sun being up in the sky. But you can imagine that the energy from the sun enters the primary producers, the plants that we were talking about, not just plants, but also photosynthetic bacteria like cyanobacteria, any type of an organism that can photosynthesize. And that's mainly just going to be plants and photosynthetic bacteria. So these primary producers are able to absorb some of the energy from the sun that hits them. But you can imagine that a lot of energy from the sun probably radiates down toward the plants, and the plants are able only to capture some portion of that energy. And so one of the things that we see in this pyramid diagram is we see that the energy obtained by each subsequent consumer group is actually going to shrink. So primary producers they take some of the energy from the sun and are able to produce that energy to use for themselves. But then that energy can pass into a primary consumer, if that primary consumer eats the plant. So let's think of a primary consumer. If a plant is a primary producer, then think of something that eats plants. Let's say a cow grazing on grass would be a good example of a primary consumer. So a primary consumer then, let's see, let's put grass here as an example for a primary producer, and we'll put cow here for an example of a primary consumer. And then to think of what would be a secondary consumer, we just have to imagine what would eat a cow, and that's fairly easy for us since we eat cow all the time, so I'll put human here as a secondary consumer. Now what you'll notice with the pyramid is that each subsequent level of the pyramid shrinks a bit to indicate that the amount of energy taken from the level below shrinks. So of the original energy used by the plant, produced by the plant, the cow only receives a portion of that. And then of the energy that the cow receives from plants to build its own body, humans can only receive a portion of that. So one of the things that this does is it actually limits populations as you go from producer to primary consumer to secondary consumer, because there's ultimately less energy available for living organisms as you move up the food chain. So we'll look here just at this fourth trophic level, and I think, let me just label over here on the side. These would be the trophic levels 4, 3, 2, and 1. So up at the fourth trophic level, we have tertiary consumer. So you can imagine a tertiary consumer is going to be some kind of an animal that consumes an animal that consumed other animals. So in some cases, humans probably fit into this category as well, and so it probably depends how you think about humans. In some senses, we are tertiary consumers. So let's imagine a different situation here. Instead of cow and human and grass, let's go. Let's imagine, let's say a seed, some type of seed, as part of our primary producer, a seed that came from some plant. And then we can imagine some type of rodent that fed off that seed, like maybe a little mouse of some kind. And then we can imagine a secondary consumer like a snake feeding off that rodent and gaining some of the energy from that rodent. And then we can imagine a tertiary consumer like an eagle or some kind of a bird of prey that might swoop down and eat that snake. And there we would have a tertiary consumer, an animal that consumed an animal that consumed an animal that consumed some sort of primary producer. So I'll end here just by talking briefly about one other type of autotrophs. So the autotrophs, the producers that we've been talking about in this example are photoautotrophs because they obtain their energy from the sun. They feed themselves from the sun. And photo, that prefix that I put in front of the word autotroph, photo means light. So there's another type of autotroph that exists, though, which is a chemoautotroph. And let me write these two out here. So I've got a photoautotroph, and then I have a, looking at heterotroph there, and then I have a chemoautotroph. And so, well, it's fair to say that most of the energy that organisms obtain up the food chain comes from the sun, ultimately, because most organisms feed themselves on plants or on organisms that feed themselves on plants. And since plants get their energy from the sun, that is really where all organism energy comes from. But there is a small class of organisms that actually are able to obtain energy, feed themselves, just from chemicals found in the earth. So an example of this would be some kind of a bacteria living, say, in a cave that might have access to a gas like hydrogen sulfide. There are some examples of bacteria that are able to produce energy for themselves using hydrogen sulfide gas, and these would be chemoautotrophs. They may never have exposure to the sun. And these chemoautotrophs can also act just like our photoautotrophs. The chemoautotrophs can also act as the base for another food chain. So if in that cave you have other type of bacteria or microscopic organisms that live off of that chemoautotrophic bacteria, you may then have small insects that live off of those other organisms, and you can build a small ecosystem from there. And so in fact, we see small ecosystems inside of caves that don't have to have any interaction with the sun or the outside environment. So hopefully this explains a little bit about trophic levels, about producers and consumers, and helps clear up some key concepts in ecology.